I was standing in the lobby of my father's company when he said it. Not shouted, not whispered, just loud enough that the receptionist stopped typing and the glass conference room went quiet. "You'll regret walking away," he said, folding his arms like he'd already won. I remember the smell first. Polished marble and burnt coffee. The faint citrus cleaner they used every morning so the place would smell successful. I'd grown up breathing that scent. It used to mean safety, stability, pride. That day, it felt like being erased. I was holding a cardboard box. Not a dramatic one, no desk lamp, no framed photos. Just notebooks. Legal pads. Years of ideas he'd told me were cute, interesting, or not practical. My name wasn't on any office door. It never had been. He didn't ask me to sit. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't even look angry. That was the part that hurt most. "You're emotional," he continued, glancing at his watch. "This phase will pass. And when it does, you'll realize how foolish this was." I wanted to say something sharp. Something devastating. Something that would make everyone in that lobby understand exactly what was happening. Instead, I nodded. I always nodded. Because what I didn't realize then was how trained I was to disappear quietly. Behind me, I could feel the eyes. Employees who'd watched me grow up wandering the halls after school. People who'd once smiled indulgently when my father introduced me as my daughter. She's creative. Creative. Not capable. Not competent. Not worthy of being taken seriously. My father finally looked at me then. Really looked. And he smiled. Not warmly. Pityingly. "You don't have the leverage you think you do," he said. "This world doesn't reward idealism. It rewards ownership." Ownership. The word landed heavier than he knew. Because I was already thinking about something he'd forgotten. Something he'd dismissed. Something he'd never bothered to protect. They didn't know what I had already done. The thought pulsed through me as I tightened my grip on the box. I turned toward the exit. That was when he said it, the line he'd later pretend he never uttered. "No one's going to license anything from you." There it was. Not concern. Not disappointment. Contempt. I paused. Just for a second. Enough to let the moment burn itself into my memory. Because I knew deep down that this sentence would matter someday. Outside, the air was too bright. Too loud. The city didn't care that I'd just walked away from the only place that had ever defined me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from my mother, sent an hour earlier. "Don't push him. You know how he is." I deleted it without replying. What I didn't realize then was that this wasn't just me leaving a company. This was me stepping out of a narrative that had been written for me since childhood. A narrative where my father was the architect and I was merely a footnote. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't scream. I just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the reflection of the building in my rearview mirror. So much glass. So many floors. So many ideas that weren't truly his. And as I drove away, one quiet, terrifying question followed me. If I wasn't his daughter anymore, who was I allowed to become? What I didn't know yet was that the answer would cost him more than pride. It would cost him control. And the company he believed I needed would one day need me. But not yet. Not even close. When people hear that I walked away from my father's company, they imagine rebellion. A slammed door. A raised voice. A dramatic declaration of independence. The truth was quieter. It always had been. Growing up, my father believed silence was obedience and obedience was love. He never said that out loud, but he didn't have to. It was written into every dinner conversation where he spoke uninterrupted. Every family gathering where my accomplishments were summarized in half a sentence, right before a detailed account of his latest acquisition. "She's good with ideas," he'd say, smiling politely. "But she doesn't have the stomach for execution." People would nod. I would smile. And something inside me would fold itself smaller. What I didn't realize then was that he was training me. Not to lead. To observe. I spent my childhood perched at the edge of conference rooms, pretending to do homework while executives argued about manufacturing timelines, intellectual property disputes, and strategic assets. I learned early which voices carried weight and which were dismissed no matter how correct they were. I learned how often brilliance was ignored simply because it came from the wrong mouth. Especially a woman's. Especially mine. When I was 22, fresh out of school, I brought him my first real proposal. Not a whim. Not a sketch on a napkin. A fully developed system. A modular process that streamlined one of his company's most expensive bottlenecks. He flipped through the pages in under a minute. You think too theoretically, he said, handing it back. This business runs on relationships, not concepts. A week later, I watched him praise a consultant for suggesting something eerily similar. That was the first time I felt it. Not anger. Not jealousy. Recognition. He wasn't incapable of seeing my value. He was unwilling to acknowledge it. And there was a difference. Still, I stayed. Because daughters like me don't leave. We adapt. We soften. We wait. I became the one who stayed late without being asked. The one who caught errors before they turned into lawsuits. The one who quietly documented processes no one thought to protect. What I didn't realize then was how dangerous my habit of documentation would become. Every system I designed, I archived. Every workflow improvement I tested quietly on the side, I timestamped. Every conceptual framework I refined after hours, I stored on drives my father never bothered to ask about. He trusted me, not because he respected me, but because he underestimated me. That's a dangerous combination. You're lucky, he told me once, after dismissing me from a meeting I'd helped prepare. Most people don't get to learn at my side. I nodded. But inside, a different lesson was forming. He thought proximity equaled ownership. I was learning that creation did not. The day before the lobby confrontation, I overheard him laughing with a board member. She's dependable, he said. But she's not someone you build an empire around. I stood in the hallway unseen, listening to my future being reduced to a liability. What I didn't realize then was that moment would clarify everything. Because for the first time, I stopped asking how to earn my place. And started asking what I already owned. That night, I went home and opened my files. Years of work. Systems he'd dismissed, but quietly implemented. Frameworks with my fingerprints all over them, except nowhere that mattered. I noticed something chilling. None of it was formally assigned. No contracts. No IP transfer agreements. No licensing clauses. Just trust. His favorite mistake. By the time I walked into that lobby the next morning with a cardboard box, my decision had already been made. I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I was leaving unfinished. And that terrified him more than anger ever could. What I didn't realize then was how long he'd underestimate the consequences of that choice. Or how expensive silence can become when it finally starts charging interest. The first year after I walked away, nothing happened. No calls. No threats. No dramatic consequences. Just silence. The kind that settles into your bones and makes you question whether you ever mattered at all. I downsized my life quickly. Sold the car he'd helped me buy. Moved into a smaller apartment where the walls were thin and the heating worked only when it felt like it. I told myself it was temporary. A transition. A necessary discomfort. But at night, alone with my thoughts, doubt crept in. What if he was right? What if I had walked away from the only leverage I'd ever have? I freelanced. Consulted. Took work that paid less than my worth because my name carried no weight without his attached to it. When people asked about my background, I watched their expressions change the moment I didn't say the company's name. Doors didn't slam shut. They simply failed to open. What I didn't realize then was how much power anonymity can hide. In my spare hours, stolen between client calls and budget spreadsheets, I returned to my systems. Not to pitch them. Not to sell them. To refine them. I rebuilt the frameworks from scratch, tightening every assumption, documenting every evolution. I tested them quietly with small clients who didn't care who my father was. Only whether their problems disappeared. They did. Every time. Still, I stayed invisible. That was intentional. Because I was watching something else unfold. My father's company started expanding aggressively. New markets. New verticals. Press releases full of buzzwords that made my chest tighten. I recognized the language. Not his. Mine. Entire operational shifts mirrored the backbone of systems he'd once called too theoretical. The same modular logic. The same efficiency metrics. Even the same terminology, softened just enough to look original. What I didn't realize then was how carelessly he'd assumed ownership. No patents. No licenses. No attribution. Just usage. He thought silence meant surrender. I let him. Because here's the thing no one tells you about power. The person who rushes to assert it usually doesn't have it. I waited. 2 years passed. Then 3. My work grew sharper. My clients grew larger. Quiet referrals led to quiet contracts. I never advertised. I never posted thought leadership. I never positioned myself as a disruptor. I positioned myself as a solution. One night, long after midnight, I pulled up a public filing from my father's company. Buried deep in a technical appendix was a process description so familiar it made my hands shake. Line for line. Structure for structure. The system. My system. They hadn't just borrowed inspiration. They had built dependency. And dependency, without permission, has a price. What I didn't realize then was how fragile their confidence really was. Because when a company scales around an unlicensed core, it becomes trapped by it. Change it, and everything breaks. Remove it, and nothing functions. That was the night I stopped being afraid. Not because I planned revenge, but because I understood leverage. I didn't confront him. I didn't warn him. I didn't even acknowledge what I'd seen. Instead, I did something far more dangerous. I formalized my ownership, registered everything, documented timelines, filed protections, quietly, methodically, legally. By the time the paperwork was complete, his company was too deeply entangled to pretend I didn't exist. What I didn't realize then was how poetic the timing would become. Because shortly after, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. A polished voice on the other end. "This is legal counsel for," he paused, naming my father's company. "We'd like to discuss a potential collaboration." Collaboration? I almost laughed. Instead, I thanked him calmly and asked him to put everything in writing. After I hung up, I sat very still. This wasn't victory. Not yet. This was the moment before gravity remembers it exists. And somewhere I knew my father was still confident. Still certain. Still believing I'd regret walking away. What he didn't know was that his company had already started paying for it. Just not in invoices yet. The first email came with perfect grammar and carefully neutral language. No accusations. No admissions. Just interest. "We believe there may be overlap between your proprietary methodologies and certain internal processes currently in use by our organization." Overlap. As if my work had wandered into their building on its own. I read it twice, then forwarded it to an attorney I'd hired months earlier. Not in anticipation of this moment, but because something in me had learned never to walk into a room alone again. What I didn't realize then was how quickly politeness turns into panic. Their next message arrived less than 48 hours later. This one asked for a call. I declined. Instead, I requested documentation. Usage scope, deployment timelines, revenue attribution. The silence that followed was delicious. Because silence, this time, wasn't emptiness. It was calculation. When they finally responded, it was with a proposed meeting. Neutral location, neutral mediators, neutral tone. My father's name wasn't mentioned once. That was how I knew he was involved. He never stayed invisible when he felt powerful. The conference room they chose smelled exactly like the lobby I'd left years earlier. Polished wood. Burnt coffee. Citrus cleaner. I wondered if he noticed the symmetry. He arrived late. Not rushed. Not apologetic. Just controlled. He looked older. The kind of older success gives you. Heavier, sharper, more certain of itself. For a moment, our eyes met. No recognition flickered there. Only irritation. Like I was an inconvenience that had learned to speak. "You could have handled this internally," he said, sitting down. "Before it escalated." I smiled. "That would have required you to acknowledge me," I replied. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably. What I didn't realize then was how unprepared he was for my calm. He'd expected anger. Bitterness. Maybe a plea. What he got was documentation. Timelines. Version histories. Client case studies. Evidence of creation. Evidence of ownership. As my attorney spoke, my father grew quieter. Not defensive. Strategic. "You want money," he said finally. "That's what this is." I tilted my head. "No," I said. "I want alignment." He laughed. A short, dismissive sound. "You don't dictate terms here." And that was when I slid the final document across the table. A dependency analysis. A clean, clinical breakdown of what would happen if my system were removed from their operations. Lost efficiency. Delayed production. Contractual penalties. A cascade of consequences, all tied to something he'd never bothered to protect. What I didn't realize then was how frightening competence can be when it doesn't ask permission. For the first time, his confidence cracked. Just slightly. "We'll license it," he said quickly. "Temporarily. Until we develop an alternative." I shook my head. "You've been developing an alternative for 3 years," I said. "You just didn't know it belonged to me." Silence fell. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about recognition. And recognition, when delayed too long, becomes expensive. I stood to leave. We'll be in touch, his attorney said, voice tight. I paused at the door. You already are, I replied. Outside, my hands shook. Not from fear. From restraint. Because the part of me that had learned to disappear wanted to scream. But the part that had learned to wait knew better. This wasn't the moment he understood the cost. This was the moment he realized there would be one. What I didn't realize then was how personal he'd make it next. Or how publicly he'd try to reclaim control. And how that attempt would finally expose everything he'd taught me to hide. My father didn't call me after the meeting. He didn't need to. He did what he'd always done when he felt cornered. He controlled the narrative. It started subtly. A trade publication ran a flattering profile on him. Visionary founder navigates IP challenges in a rapidly evolving market. My name wasn't mentioned, but the implication was clear. Innovation was happening around him, not because of anyone else. Then came the whispers. A former colleague reached out under the guise of catching up. Asked careful questions about my consulting phase. Wondered aloud if I was feeling overwhelmed managing things on my own. I smiled through the call and gave her nothing. Because what I didn't realize then was how desperate he'd become to make me look small. A week later, his company announced an internal initiative, a newly developed proprietary framework, aimed at reducing dependency on external methodologies. External. I read the press release slowly. It was my system, rewritten clumsily. Stripped of its elegance. Over-engineered in places that revealed they didn't fully understand why it worked. That was the danger of copying without comprehension. Still, the message was clear. He was daring me to react. I didn't. Instead, I did something far less visible. I spoke to my clients. Not about him. Not about the company. About standards. I revised my licensing agreements. Clarified usage terms. Tightened compliance language. Every new contract carried a clause that made unauthorized replication expensive. Then I waited. What I didn't realize then was how fast his alternative would unravel. The first sign came from an industry forum, a quiet post about unexpected inefficiencies after a recent operational update. Then a delayed shipment. Then a missed deadline that triggered a penalty clause with one of their biggest partners. None of it was catastrophic. Yet, but I could feel the pressure building. He finally called me late one evening. No greeting. No preamble. You're enjoying this, he said. I closed my eyes. No, I replied. I'm respecting it. There was a pause. I could almost hear him recalibrating. You want credit, he said. Fine. We can talk attribution. I smiled to myself. This was never about credit. This is about consent, I said. And you didn't ask. His voice sharpened. You're my daughter. There it was. The card he'd kept in his pocket all these years. I said softly. Until you made that conditional. Silence stretched between us. What I didn't realize then was how much that sentence would haunt him. The next day, his company's legal team sent a revised proposal. Higher fees. Broader licensing scope. Still temporary. Still framed as a concession. I declined. Politely. Firmly. Because power doesn't beg, it waits for clarity. What followed was his final mistake. He went public. At a conference panel, with cameras rolling, he joked about overzealous former collaborators and the importance of knowing who really builds the foundation. I watched the clip once. Then I forwarded it to my attorney. Along with documentation. Along with timestamps. Along with proof that the foundation he claimed was his had been designed, tested, and refined by someone he'd taught never to speak up. The response from his board was swift. They didn't call me. They called him. Emergency meetings. Risk assessments. Shareholder concerns about IP exposure. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't his to control. What I didn't realize then was how quickly authority dissolves when it loses credibility. He showed up at my door 2 days later. No suit. No entourage. Just him. I built everything, he said, standing in the hallway like a stranger. I looked at him for a long moment. No, I said. You owned everything. There's a difference. His shoulders sagged just slightly. For the first time, I saw fear where certainty used to live. But this still wasn't the end. Because ownership, once questioned, doesn't resolve quietly. It escalates. And the final decision wouldn't be his. The board didn't invite me at first. They debated me like an abstract risk. A variable. A problem to be contained. I knew this because one of them called by accident. He left a voicemail meant for someone else, clipped, irritated, and revealing in the way powerful people forget to be careful when they assume no one's listening. If we suspend the system even temporarily, we miss Q4 targets. That triggers penalties. We can't afford a shutdown over pride. Pride. I replayed the message twice. What I didn't realize then was how much the company had already chosen me, even before they admitted it. 2 days later, a formal invitation arrived. Boardroom. Full attendance. Legal present. My father's name was last on the list. I wore nothing dramatic. No power suit. No statement jewelry. Just something neutral. Something calm. Because intimidation only works if you appear to be trying. When I walked in, the air shifted. Not hostility. Assessment. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a dependency. The chairwoman spoke first. "We've reviewed the materials," she said. "Extensively." I nodded. "We believe continued use of your system is unavoidable." Another board member added carefully. "Unavoidable." I let the word hang. "What are your terms?" the chairwoman asked. I took a breath. Not because I was nervous. Because I was precise. "Perpetual licensing," I said. "Usage-based fees. Audit rights. Attribution in internal documentation. And a non-replication clause." My father stiffened. "That's excessive," he snapped. I turned to him slowly. "What's excessive?" I said. "Is building your future on something you never had permission to use." The room went silent. What I didn't realize then was how many people in that room had been waiting for someone to say that to him. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "We're prepared to accept most of those conditions," she said. "But the fees? They scale with revenue," I replied. "Which means when you grow, I grow." Alignment. That word again. My father laughed, sharp and humorless. "You're punishing us," he said. "You're punishing me." I met his eyes. "No," I said quietly. "I'm charging market rate." That was when it happened. The moment I'd imagined 100 times and never fully believed would come. The chairwoman turned to him. "This is no longer a negotiation," she said. "This is risk management." Risk management. The board voted. Not unanimously, but decisively. The company would license my system. Indefinitely. What I didn't realize then was how small he would look when the vote passed. Not diminished. Just ordinary. After the meeting, he caught up to me in the hallway. "You planned this," he said. I stopped walking. "I survived this," I replied. His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time in my life, he had no rebuttal. The contract arrived a week later. Thick. Precise. Binding. Every quarter, his company would pay licensing fees to an entity bearing my name. Not as a favor. As a requirement. I signed it without ceremony. No champagne. No celebration. Just relief. But something unexpected followed. He started telling people he was proud of me. Not directly. Through others. As if distance could soften history. What I didn't realize then was that pride, offered this late, feels less like validation and more like theft. He called me once more after the deal closed. "We could still work together," he said. "Build something bigger." I closed my eyes. Because part of me still wanted a father. But another part, the part he'd trained too well, recognized a pattern. "No," I said. "We already did." I hung up before he could respond. That should have been the end. The clean resolution. The poetic justice. But power never exits quietly. Because the moment money starts flowing the wrong direction, resentment looks for a new strategy. And I didn't yet know what my father would do when he realized I wasn't just necessary. I was untouchable. The money started arriving before the apologies did. Quarterly transfers. Clean. On time. Automated. My name on the line item. Not daughter. Not consultant. Not former employee. Licenser. I thought seeing it would feel triumphant. It didn't. It felt quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a storm when you're not sure what's been damaged until you start walking around. My father stopped calling after the first payment cleared. Instead, I heard about him through other people. How he'd grown more irritable in meetings. How he double-checked numbers he used to trust instinctively. How he hated that a portion of every success now had to be acknowledged somewhere, even if only in accounting software, as not fully his. What I didn't realize then was how unbearable that would become for him. Because men like my father don't measure power by wealth. They measure it by authorship. And I had rewritten the story without his permission. The final attempt came 6 months later. He invited me to lunch. Not a boardroom. Not an office. A small restaurant we used to go to when I was a teenager. One of the few places where he'd ever seemed human. I almost didn't go. But curiosity has always been my weakness. He was already seated when I arrived. No phone. No papers. Just him. "You've done well," he said after we ordered. I nodded. He leaned forward. "You don't need to keep punishing the company," he said. "We could restructure. Buy you out." There it was. The last card. Ownership, reclaimed through acquisition. "I'm not punishing anyone," I replied. "I'm participating." He shook his head. "You don't understand," he said. "This isn't how families work." I looked at him for a long moment. "No," I said. "This is how business works. You taught me that." Something in his expression shifted then. Not anger. Loss. He'd always believed he was shaping me. What he never considered was that I was learning from him. Not to become him, but to survive him. "I was trying to protect you," he said quietly. And for the first time, I believed he meant it. But protection that erases you isn't safety. It's control. "I didn't need protection," I said. "I needed acknowledgement." He sat back, eyes glossy. "I didn't know how," he admitted. And maybe that was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get. When the check came, I paid. He didn't argue. We stood outside, awkward and unfinished. "Will you ever forgive me?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness had always been presented to me as something soft, generous, required. But I'd learned something else. Forgiveness without change is just permission. "I've moved on," I said. "That's not the same thing." He nodded, as if filing the distinction away too late to matter. I watched him walk to his car, smaller than I remembered. Not defeated. Just human. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and opened a new document. Not a system. Not a framework. A boundary. I wrote down what I would never trade again. Not for money, not for approval, not for proximity to power. My voice. My ownership. My timing. Because the real revenge wasn't that his company paid me. It was that I no longer needed him to see me. The next quarter's payment arrived right on schedule. I didn't check the amount. I already knew what it meant. I had walked away when he told me I'd regret it. And he was right, just not in the way he imagined. Because regret, when it changes sides, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a lesson. One he now funds. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.